been asked to come here to talk about how to develop the good heart, and I'll have 2 sessions on that, one this evening, and then in a month's time I'll be back here and have another session. So this evening's session, the topic is going to be cultivating loving kindness for ourselves and others. So we've got, I think, 2 hours this evening. So the program this evening is that we're going to first start by defining what do we mean by loving kindness. And then, of course, loving kindness is to do with happiness. And so then we're going to look at what do we mean by happiness, what are the causes of happiness, and how do we cultivate those causes. And then we're going to have a meditation session in terms of cultivating loving kindness, particularly toward ourselves first. And then I'd like to discuss a little bit about the differences between loving kindness and attachment, because I think there's a lot of confusion there. And then we'll have a little break in the middle for 10 or 15 minutes. So I think there's some tea and biscuits over there available. After the break, we'll do another meditation session again on cultivating loving kindness, and now we'll expand that out to others. And then I'd like to talk a little bit more about dealing with attachment, because it's very closely related to this topic. And then there'll be time for some question-answer at the end of the session. But also, I like to have these sessions interactive, so if you have any specific questions regarding what I'm talking about, then please ask questions as we go. If you have more general questions, then maybe we can leave those to the end of the session. So plenty of time for questions at the end of the session as well. Okay, so let's begin. So first off, if we're talking about cultivating loving kindness, then it would be very good to know what do we mean by loving kindness, the word, to define it. The word loving kindness is a translation of the original Sanskrit word maitri, or the Pali word metta. And both of those words there literally mean memory. So maitri, metta, loving kindness, these words here are defined as simply the aspiration or wish for ourselves and others to be happy. Or in other words, the wish or aspiration for ourselves and others to have happiness and its causes. So what we notice is that these words here are not an emotion or a behaviour, they're an aspiration or a wish. So therefore it's better to translate these words as loving kindness rather than sometimes they're translated as love. Because the word love in the English language is definitely an emotion, and often it implies some sort of intimate behaviour. But here, maitri and metta is not an emotion, and it's certainly not any sort of behaviour. It's an aspiration or wish. It's an aspiration or wish for ourselves and others to have happiness and its causes. So, therefore, of course, most of us already have this aspirational wish to be happy, but often our aspirational wish to be happy is a little bit misdirected. And actually, in the end, we don't really find that happiness, and often we end up with more suffering. And this is very nicely summarized by a great Indian master, Buddhist master from the 8th century, Shantideva, who says, "Those desiring to escape from suffering hasten right toward their own misery, and with the very desire for happiness, out of delusion they destroy their own well-being as if it were the enemy." So therefore, if we really want to cultivate loving kindness, then we need to know what is happiness, what are the causes of happiness, and how do we cultivate those causes. Because if we don't know those 3 things, then loving kindness, the wish for ourselves and others to be happy, is just words that have no meaning. So if we really want to cultivate effectively loving kindness, we need to know those three things. We need to know what is happiness, what are the causes of happiness, how do we cultivate those causes. If we know those three things, then the cultivating of loving kindness for ourselves and others has meaning. So first, let's have a look at what do we mean by happiness. The two types of happiness we can talk about, the first is called temporal happiness, and that's another name for our pleasurable experiences. And our pleasurable experiences, of course, is a stimulus-based happiness. We have a certain stimulus, we have a pleasant experience. So therefore, because it's a stimulus-based happiness, it's often called conditioned happiness, that it requires certain conditions coming together for us to have that experience. And therefore, by its nature, it's, as the name temporal suggests, it's transient. Not only is it transient, but it's unreliable, because we can't just click our fingers and have a pleasant experience whenever we want one. It requires certain conditions to come together. It requires a certain stimulus. If the stimulus is not there, there's no pleasant experience. Also, if we look closely at our pleasant experiences, what we understand or what we can come to see is they're not really even in the nature of happiness. Because if our pleasant experiences were in the nature of happiness, it would mean the more that we engaged in pleasant experiences, the more happy we should become. But we know from our own experience that often if we overindulge in our pleasant experiences, not only don't we become more happy, often that induces a lot of extra unnecessary suffering. For example, the classic is eating too much of our favourite dessert or staying too long out in the warm, nice sunshine. They don't tend to make us more happy. We maybe get sunburnt and dehydrated, or from eating too much dessert, we get sick in the stomach. So this is one type of happiness called temporal happiness, our pleasurable experience. Again, stimulus-based happiness. But there's a second type of happiness called genuine happiness. And that is a state of inner well-being. And this type of happiness is not a stimulus-based happiness, meaning we don't require a particular stimulus to have this genuine happiness. Therefore, it's often called unconditioned happiness. It does not require certain conditions to come together for us to have that genuine happiness. And so therefore, by its nature, it's more stable, more reliable, and is in the nature of happiness. And so here, when we talk about cultivating loving kindness for ourselves and others, of course, we're mainly talking about the second one. But we're not talking about excluding the first one. Because now what we do is we tend to conflate those two in terms of hoping that our pleasurable experiences are going to give us some sort of lasting, genuine happiness. So we're hoping that the first one will give us the second one. So we're conflating them. And of course, what that really translates into is it simply translates into craving and attachment for pleasant experiences. And that craving and attachment for pleasant experiences only induces suffering. Because usually with that craving and attachment for pleasurable experiences comes worry and anxiety about not getting it, not getting enough of it, or losing it. And then, of course, frustration when we don't get it, overindulging when we do get it, and often then ending up with a lot of unnecessary suffering. Also often ends up with dissatisfaction when things don't live up to our expectations, getting upset when we do lose it, that pleasant experience. And then, of course, it simply ends up with more craving because we think that the reason we're not happy is we just simply didn't get enough of that. So we end up with more craving. So it's a sort of vicious circle that we get caught up in. And then also, of course, craving and attachment is never satisfied. Craving and attachment is always looking for something bigger, better, and different, which means that actually we end up losing out or not enjoying the things we used to enjoy if we get them too often, because after a while, craving and attachment goes, sorry, that's not good enough anymore. I need something bigger, better, and different. So what we can see is that if we end up with craving and attachment to pleasant experiences, hoping that they're going to give us some lasting, genuine happiness, we're just going to end up with all of this suffering. If we don't conflate the two and understand there are two types of happiness and strive for genuine happiness, this inner well-being, then the side benefit of that is actually we end up enjoying our pleasurable experiences more than we have ever done before. Because often people mistakenly think, when they hear a little bit about this genuine happiness, people think, oh, it's a choice. Either I have to go for pleasure or genuine happiness. And somehow people go, I don't want to become a Buddhist because I don't want to give up my pleasure, because you Buddhists go for the genuine happiness and you don't like that pleasure stuff. But that's a complete misunderstanding. What Buddhism is really saying is that please understand your pleasurable experiences for what they are. Merely temporary, transient, pleasant experiences. And don't hope or grasp onto them and hope that they're going to give us some lasting, genuine happiness. So if we can understand that, we can, if we get a pleasurable experience, we'll actually enjoy it much more than we've ever done without the craving and attachment. So we can have our cake and eat it as well. So therefore, when we talk about cultivating loving kindness, again, we're mainly talking about the wish or aspiration for ourselves and others to find this genuine happiness and to cultivate the causes of genuine happiness. So then, if we're talking about genuine happiness, we need to know what are the causes of genuine happiness, because if we don't know what the causes are, again, loving kindness is just words that have no meaning if we don't know what the causes are of that genuine happiness. So let's have a look at now, what do we mean, or what are the causes of genuine happiness? And here we find actually in all Buddhist traditions a very similar presentation. And there are three elements we need to focus on as the causes of genuine happiness. The first of those is ethics. In Sanskrit, Shila. And so ethics is the foundation for striving for genuine happiness. And all the various Buddhist traditions, we can sort of categorize them into two groups. There are what's called the Theravada Buddhist traditions and the Mahayana Buddhist traditions. The Theravada Buddhist traditions, of course, are coming from the sort of original teachings of the foundation teachings of the Buddha, the Four Noble Truths, and then were spread from India through the Pali language to countries such as Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Southeast Asia. So in these Buddhist countries now, they're collectively known as the Theravada Buddhist traditions. And so in these traditions, when we talk about ethics, what is the core of ethics for these traditions? Anyone know when in Theravada traditions, when they talk about ethics, what are we really talking about? What is the essence of ethics in the Theravada traditions? Anyone know? No. Well, Vinaya is ethics, but so basically the core of ethics, of course, is avoiding non-virtue, avoiding harmful behaviour. So we often see here in these traditions this list of these 10 things that we're supposed to avoid, these 10 negative behaviours. The Mahayana Buddhist traditions are coming particularly from what's called the perfection of wisdom teachings of the Buddha. They're introducing this idea of complete, full enlightenment, and these teachings were transmitted from India through the Sanskrit language and went to countries over the Silk Route into China, Korea, Japan, Vietnam, and then over the Himalayas into Tibet. So all of these Buddhist traditions are collectively now called the Mahayana Buddhist traditions. So what is the core of ethics in the Mahayana traditions? Anyone?
Benefit to others.
Yeah. So the Mahayana Buddhist traditions, of course, build on Theravada. So ethics, of course, is avoiding non-virtue, but it's much more proactive in terms of engaging in virtue and benefiting others. So this is what we mean by ethics. The second of the three elements, or the three main causes of genuine happiness, is what's called concentration. The Sanskrit word for concentration is samadhi. So here, of course, in concentration, we're developing single-pointed concentration. Now, in the Theravada and Mahayana traditions, this concentration practice, often you'll see slightly different names for that. Usually in the Theravada traditions, when they talk about this concentration practice, they use this word jhana. We're practicing the jhanas. Whereas in the Mahayana traditions, we often see the Sanskrit word shamatha. We're doing shamatha practice. So both jhana and shamatha, of course, are this concentration practice to develop single-pointed concentration. We just have these, and these are different levels of concentration, but they're both concentration practice, developing this single-pointed concentration. And then the third main element or cause of genuine happiness, of course, is wisdom. In Sanskrit, prajna, Another word similar to this that you often see is the word vipassana. Which means insight. Of course, many of you are probably more familiar with the Pali term vipassana. So both vipassana and vipassana mean insight into the nature of reality. It's just another name for the wisdom practice. So when we talk about vipassana practice in the Theravada tradition, what are we